and shorten the list of prohibited goods, to increase visas for aid workers, and to process them more quickly.
Well, joining me to discuss all of that in a bit more detail is Laura Blumenfeld, a Middle East analyst and a former senior policy advisor on the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team. Welcome to BBC News. I understood you worked under John Kerry. Is that correct, when he was Secretary of State?
That's right. And we used to say, go big or go home. And we went big and failed. And we went home and there was a war. Let's hope for a better outcome this time.
If you were still working in that department, if you were advising Mr. Blinken, what would you be saying to him? This is his 8th visit to the region since the war began. And there's still not a concrete ceasefire that has been agreed to.
Well, I would say, look, Blinken is just unrivaled in his diplomatic finesse. I also think this calls for emotional intelligence. Netanyahu has been saying from the beginning that we will achieve total victory. So obviously that's just a matter of wordsmithing. I would say to him, you need to give Netanyahu the feeling that he's now re-achieved that deterrence, which is what it's all about. I mean, I've interviewed all of these leaders, including Netanyahu. And one thing he told me was when his big brother was raising him, Yoni Netanyahu, he taught him many things, to read Plato, the names of all the flowers in the fields behind their house. But he also taught him how to street fight. And he said to him, Bibi, that was his nickname, Netanyahu, he said, he who delivers the first blow wins. So on October 7th, Hamas clearly delivered that first blow. And ever since then, Netanyahu's been trying to play catch up. I think Blinken's got to kind of manipulate Netanyahu into that place where he feels like he can have the win. And if not, honestly, I think it's going to be a matter of an arm wrestle behind closed doors. And he'll have to use the one word that everyone understands, which is weapons. And if there's some kind of understanding for Netanyahu that he won't have that supply of weapons from the United States, he'll fall into line as he has in the past.
Do you think he will? Because there's a lot of pressure. We saw there earlier in the week or the weekend, Benny Gantz quitting the war cabinet. On one side, you've got people like Gantz. On the other hand, you've got hostage families who say that not enough's being done to secure the release of their loved ones. There's an awful lot of pressure he faces at home, let alone from the US.
Absolutely. And it's all public pressure, which I think is a big mistake here. I mean, as Secretary Madeleine Albright said, negotiations thrive in the darkness. They're like mushrooms. They need darkness to succeed. And right now we're negotiating. It's like this high noon negotiation in the bright and blinding light. I think what happens behind closed doors is going to be much more important, which is why you don't hear Netanyahu saying publicly that he embraces the ceasefire proposal. I mean, for him, no answer is better than a no answer, right? In the past, ambiguity has given us a way to kind of give us room to maneuver diplomatically. And you can square any circle if you squint easily enough. The problem is, even with Hamas, that just recently said that they are favorable toward the ceasefire proposal, they're saying, I'd like clarification of the word ceasefire, right? I want to understand what you mean by that. And the problem is there's no trust, which is the currency of any diplomacy, as Secretary Kissinger said. They want something in writing. They want the Americans to back it up. You know, as the Italians say, la carta canta, the document sings. They want it in writing.
OK, let's bring our panel in, but do stay with us, Laura. Susan, we were just reporting there that Hamas says it has submitted its response to a proposed Gaza ceasefire. A senior group official telling the BBC it still requires an Israeli commitment to a permanent ceasefire. It feels like we've been here before when we've heard movement on one side and then on the other, and then there's still no agreement.
Yeah, an enormous frustration in the Biden administration and among American officials generally over the difficulty in getting Israel to accept some compromises to get to an end point that the U.S. wants to have. President Biden has said that Israel endorses the peace plan that the UN Security Council endorsed yesterday, but Netanyahu hasn't said that publicly. And when the Secretary of State Blinken was trying to put pressure on the leader of Hamas, he was trying to also put pressure on Netanyahu to agree to some of these measures that get you a temporary ceasefire, negotiations, the release of hostages, and then talks that hopefully would lead to a permanent ceasefire.
Let's bring Laura back in then. Laura, why isn't Mr. Netanyahu, like Susan's suggesting, why isn't he just coming out and equivocally saying, or unequivocally, I support this proposal from the US? Why are the US sort of speaking on his behalf?
Well, look, there are obvious reasons from the right wing of his coalition, but it's also really important to think about it from the Palestinian point of view. As one Israeli negotiator told me, the best way to kill any kind of proposal, anything that Israel wants, is to say that they endorse it. And that includes the day after plan. I know we've come down pretty hard on the Israelis for not producing something, but the first thing that would happen if they said, yes, we want the PA to come in riding on the back of our tanks into Gaza, would be the PA would reject it. I mean, anything that Israel wants, their enemies won't want. So in part of it is a little bit of, again, that kind of fuzziness. The only way forward here is through the fog. We just all have to agree to go that direction.
Joe, let's bring you in on this. I mean, that is still a big challenge. What happens after a permanent ceasefire is announced? What is the end game when it comes to Gaza, and who runs Gaza?
Well, I think that's the problem here. And this whole notion of a permanent ceasefire is what Netanyahu and Israel rightly should be wrestling with. And truthfully, it's what Biden and America should be wrestling with. Why this constant frustration, one-sided, always with Israel? For the last 8 months, Israel has stepped up to this plate way more than Hamas has. Hamas has had the power by just snapping their fingers and surrendering and releasing all their hostages to end this any second. Netanyahu and Israel, it's not just Netanyahu, Israel has made clear there'll be no permanent ceasefire until Hamas has zero capability of being in power or being in control. And they'll never have the ability to do what they did before. Israel has to know that before they agree to any sort of ceasefire.
Laura, how can that be possible, though? I mean, there's demands on both sides. And as Joe expressed, those are the kind of sentiments on the Israeli side. There are sentiments on the Hamas side as well. What do you see, as someone who watches this region closely, where the compromise might be?
Well, look, the truth is that there can never be a permanent ceasefire because the two sides are at permanent war. I mean, from the American point of view, which is how I look at things, I think there's a little bit of a plan B forming out there, which could help increase pressure. There's a little bit of a with you or without you kind of approach on this visit, I think, by the Americans. You know, Netanyahu has said, we will fight Hamas with you or without you world, right? We stand alone. And I hear a little bit, like, in terms of the United States putting out the message that our plan with Saudi Arabia, our security pact, we're almost there. And by the way, we're floating a plan now to negotiate directly with Hamas. So I think if America is putting its priorities forward and saying we're going to achieve our goals, it could make the two parties realize that, you know, they're going to miss out. This train is leaving, and neither party is in a hurry to reach this ceasefire deal. Mm-hmm. But if America moves heads without them, that could motivate them.
And Laura, let's just, before we wrap up this discussion, remember that there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza as well. And so many, tens of thousands have been killed already, Palestinians, and also many more are displaced. And that is the backdrop to all of this. So just very briefly, a final thought on that.
Well, I think we're almost at the point when you say that, I'm thinking of Shakespeare. And I think that the Biden administration is almost at the point where they're saying a plague on both your houses. And just sort of, and the curtain goes down and there's a scene of destruction. We saw that at the end of the Clinton administration, where he gave a big speech about putting forth a peace plan. It's called the Clinton Parameters, and said, guys, here's how I see your reasonable way forward. Good luck.
Okay.
We're not there yet, but almost.
Okay, Laura Blumenfeld, Middle East analyst, former senior policy advisor on the State Department's Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team. Thank you very much for sharing your insights on that. We'll say goodbye to Laura, but I'll be back with Susan and